No U.S. citizen is subject to civil immigration enforcement, and that just doesn't happen. There are multiple safeguards in that way, and if a U.S. citizen is detained in the course of an immigration investigation, they're quickly released. We don't take action on American citizens.
11:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. A secure authorization moved through encrypted federal channels. Within seconds, the Department of Homeland Security activated what would become the largest coordinated deportation operation in modern American history. Over 83,000 individuals flagged for immigration violations across Minneapolis and the greater Twin Cities region were placed under immediate federal action. This was not a routine compliance sweep. This was a synchronized enforcement campaign built on months of classified intelligence. What agents uncovered inside encrypted servers and layered financial networks would reveal something far more complex than immigration fraud. Investigators described it as a coordinated administrative infiltration, structured, deliberate, and engineered to operate beneath the visible surface of city systems. No gunfire, no explosions, but deep systemic penetration. For nearly 8 years, Minneapolis had quietly evolved into what intelligence analysts later labeled the most sophisticated document fraud and identity trafficking hub assembled in North America. The financial scale was staggering. An estimated $2.3 billion flowed annually through interlinked shell entities, fraudulent benefits claims, and cross-border laundering conduits. Funds moved from East African ports to Midwest bank accounts, through Canadian transit corridors, and into overseas networks tied to international extremist financing channels. At the center sat one central figure. But the most striking revelation was this. Federal authorities had been watching the entire structure for 16 months. A classified interagency task force, combining FBI counterterrorism units, ICE enforcement and removal operations, Homeland Security investigations, Treasury Department financial crimes analysts, and NSA signals intelligence operators, had constructed a digital blueprint of the operation. Every fraudulent tax return was logged, every falsified Social Security claim mapped, every shell corporation traced. Offshore wire transfers were flagged in real time. Encrypted communications between inner circle operatives and contacts in Mogadishu, Nairobi, and Istanbul were intercepted and decrypted. They identified religious centers that doubled as document production fronts. They tracked nonprofit directors cycling grant money through fabricated cultural initiatives. They flagged municipal zoning irregularities tied to suspected trafficking safe houses. They documented cash exchanges designed to stall enforcement scrutiny. What emerged was not chaos, but structure. Prosecutors would later argue that a shadow municipal protection layer had been constructed to insulate the criminal infrastructure from disruption. The codename assigned to dismantle it: Operation Shattered Compass. Launch window, 6 hours, 4:18 a.m. Central Time. February, cold pressed down on Minneapolis. Frozen streets. Low fog drifting beneath sodium streetlights. Intersections empty. The type of silence that does not feel natural in a city this size. The type of silence that signals imminent disruption. At that exact moment, over 800 federal agents were in final staging across 17 synchronized target zones. ICE tactical units in full protective gear. FBI SWAT teams equipped with ballistic shields and breaching equipment. DHS investigators carrying digital forensic extraction kits. Evidence technicians prepped for rapid seizure protocols. Overhead, 3 Black Hawk helicopters maintained circular flight paths, thermal imaging systems transmitting live feeds to federal command centers. Movement patterns were tracked. Heat signatures confirmed occupancy. 4:32 a.m. The first breach? Target, a 4-story apartment complex on Cedar Avenue, designated location Alpha. From the outside, it presented as low-income residential housing. Cracked concrete steps, graffiti-tagged brick, inoperative security cameras. Nothing about the exterior suggested strategic significance. Inside intelligence files, it was labeled the primary document fabrication node servicing an 8-state identity trafficking corridor. A hydraulic battering ram struck the reinforced entry door. Hinges collapsed inward. Flashbang devices detonated in stairwells. Agents advanced through smoke-laced corridors issuing commands in English and Somali. Boots pounded against concrete steps. Unit 304. Inside, agents discovered industrial-grade document printers calibrated to produce high-resolution state identification replicas, thermal laminators, holographic overlay application rigs, precision cutting stations, over 4,000 blank Social Security cards, birth certificates spanning 12 states, laminated driver's license templates arranged by region. At a workstation surrounded by 3 active monitors sat the lead forger, later identified in federal charging documents as a Somali national previously deported twice, each re-entry executed under a new identity profile. He bolted. 4 steps. An ICE agent intercepted him mid-stride, driving him through a folding table layered with passport photos and lamination sheets. Monitors crashed to the floor, plastic ID blanks scattered across the room like shrapnel, but Location Alpha was only one fragment. Simultaneously, coordinated federal teams breached 6 additional sites across Minneapolis. On Lake Street, agents forced entry into a halal grocery storefront identified in surveillance logs as a financial relay point operating beneath a legitimate retail facade. Agents pushed through a reinforced interior door and uncovered a back room converted into a high-volume wire transfer hub. Multiple terminals ran parallel transfers averaging $340,000 per week, routed to accounts in Turkey, Kenya, and the United Arab Emirates. Transaction logs showed rapid layering patterns designed to fragment audit trails within minutes of receipt. The store owner held 19 separate EIN registrations tied to 19 nonprofit entities, each claiming to provide cultural outreach and humanitarian relief services. None had physical office space. None maintained verifiable staff. None filed accurate tax documentation. Every entity functioned as a financial conduit, absorbing funds under charitable exemptions, then exporting capital offshore. 3 miles north in a gated suburban enclave, SWAT units breached a 7,000-square-foot residence purchased 8 months earlier for $1.9 million in cash. The buyer, a Delaware-registered shell corporation with no operational history. Intelligence briefings had identified the property as a coordination node within a human trafficking corridor moving women and minors from East Africa through Mexico, across the southern border into Texas, and ultimately north to Minneapolis distribution points. Inside the basement, agents located 12 women confined in windowless rooms. No exterior access, no personal identification documents. Ledgers detailed payments to smuggling intermediaries and cartel-linked facilitators operating through Reno transit channels. Encrypted tablets contained route schematics, border-crossing timing windows, and coded payment schedules tied to compromised checkpoint contacts. Bolted into the foundation, agents forced open a steel safe containing $680,000 in bundled cash, several gold bars, and a single external hard drive. By 6:15 a.m., more than 200 individuals had been detained across initial strike zones, but field commanders understood the visible arrests represented only the outer layer. At the FBI field office in downtown Minneapolis, cyber forensics specialists initiated decryption. Protocols on the seized hard drive. 47 minutes later, the first encryption layer collapsed. What appeared on screen forced seasoned analysts to physically step back. It was not a ledger, not a contact list. It was a full operational blueprint. The architecture extended beyond Minneapolis, mapping coordinated infiltration structures across 14 cities in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio. The system had a code name embedded in its master directory, Project Northbridge. Metadata analysis traced digital signatures to authenticated devices and email credentials belonging to Mayor Thomas Riker and 6 senior members of his administrative team. These were not compromised leaks. The files reflected authorization chains, structured approvals for each expansion phase. Documentation detailed shell corporations established using legitimate city vendor licenses, nonprofits registered with formal approval through the Office of Community Engagement, refugee resettlement contracts, structured to divert federal grant allocations into privately controlled accounts. Financial flow diagrams illustrated systematic cycling of taxpayer funds through layered accounts before redistribution into operational budgets. One file stood out, an internal memorandum dated 11 months prior. Subject line, Phase 3 authorization. It outlined geographic expansion into adjacent suburbs, strategic placement of affiliated individuals onto nonprofit boards, and insertion of aligned personnel into state-level agencies, including positions connected to Human Services Administration, refugee coordination offices, and legislative staffing roles. The closing sentence read with calculated certainty. By 2028, Minneapolis will be administratively untouchable. Federal oversight will be irrelevant. Investigators would later characterize the language as evidence of structural ambition, not improvisation, but long-term institutional positioning. 7:03 a.m. Phase 2 activated. Inside a Federal Command Center established within the U.S. Attorney's Office. A digital operations wall illuminated the Minneapolis metro area with dense red markers. Each indicator represented a confirmed Northbridge-linked site. Apartment complexes functioning as document production nodes, storefronts serving as laundering fronts, warehouses filled with goods acquired through fraudulent refund schemes, safe houses holding trafficking victims, and municipal workstations flagged for unauthorized database access. The operational directive was precise: simultaneous enforcement across 64 locations. More than 1,200 federal agents deployed, supported by state police units and National Guard logistics teams. ICE officers carried pre-signed removal orders targeting individuals with final deportation rulings who had evaded prior enforcement actions. Treasury agents prepared asset seizure warrants exceeding $40 million in combined real estate, vehicle holdings, and liquid accounts. FBI arrest. Packets were finalized for 19 primary subjects, including Mayor Thomas Riker. 8:30 a.m. Coordinated entry waves began. In Brooklyn Center, federal agents breached a tax preparation office operating within a modest strip mall. Records indicated the business had filed more than 11,000 fraudulent returns in the previous year alone, claiming billions in illegitimate refunds through stolen Social Security numbers and fabricated dependents. Asset checks revealed 7 luxury vehicles registered under layered identities and property ownership in 3 states, despite the operator reporting annual taxable income of $28,000. By mid-morning, enforcement momentum had shifted from containment to dismantlement. The structure that had operated in shadows for nearly a decade was now fully illuminated under federal seizure authority. Agents seized desktop computers still logged into IRS portals. File cabinets were packed with folders containing Social Security numbers, birth dates, addresses, thousands of identity theft victims reduced to paper stacks and spreadsheet entries. Across the city, at a community center awarded $1.2 million in federal grants for youth programs and job training, investigators opened the doors expecting classrooms, instructors, attendance rosters. They found folding chairs, blank sign-in sheets, motivational posters taped to bare walls, and no evidence of programming ever taking place. Financial tracing showed the grant funds had been routed through 6 intermediary accounts before landing in personal bank accounts controlled by nonprofit board members. 3 of those board members simultaneously held city government positions filled through appointments under Mayor Riker's administration. At Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, ICE agents executed arrest warrants on 4 baggage handlers and 2 TSA employees accused of facilitating bulk cash smuggling. Surveillance footage and financial analysis tied them to repeated instances of undeclared currency transfers. In one documented case, $460,000 in vacuum-sealed bundles had been loaded onto an outbound flight to Istanbul without customs declaration. Investigators estimate the network moved approximately $18 million annually through similar methods. Cash extracted from domestic operations and transported overseas beyond regulatory visibility. But the most consequential action unfolded at Minneapolis City Hall. 9:47 a.m. FBI agents entered the mayor's 4th-floor office carrying a federal arrest warrant signed hours earlier. Thomas Riker was seated at his desk reviewing talking points for a scheduled press event. When agents instructed him to stand, witnesses later described his reaction as controlled, measured, analytical. Not shock, not panic. A composed expression suggesting confidence in the durability of the system he had overseen. That assumption collapsed within minutes. By noon, Riker was in federal custody alongside his chief of staff, the director of community relations, 2 city council members, and the head of the Minneapolis Refugee Services Coalition. Federal indictments included wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to harbor undocumented individuals, aggravated identity theft, tax fraud, and honest services fraud. Combined statutory exposure exceeded 300 years of potential federal imprisonment. Yet the investigation widened further. As prosecutors reviewed seized communications, a second layer of compromise emerged, this time within law enforcement. Forensic review of encrypted messaging platforms and financial transfers revealed that at least 11 officers within the Minneapolis Police Department had received payments tied to Northbridge-linked entities. Patrol logs had been altered. Suspicious activity reports associated with flagged properties were removed from internal systems. In multiple instances, enforcement-sensitive information appeared to have been disclosed in advance of federal action. One sergeant, had received $87,000 over 2 years through transfers labeled as rental income for a property investigators confirmed he did not own. Another officer had accepted a luxury SUV provided by a nonprofit director later indicted in exchange for advance notification of immigration enforcement operations within his patrol zone. A third officer had previously intervened during a federal action, asserting jurisdictional authority and instructing agents to withdraw from a property later confirmed to be holding trafficking victims. For officers who had spent years documenting anomalies only to see cases stall, the evidence clarified patterns that once appeared bureaucratic. Reports that vanished, investigations reassigned without explanation, enforcement delays concentrated in specific neighborhoods despite recurring complaints. Digital logs now suggested structured obstruction rather than administrative inefficiency. Later that afternoon, inside the federal building, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Minnesota addressed national media. Behind him stood display boards outlining financial pathways, organizational charts, and asset seizures. The statement was direct. What investigators uncovered was a coordinated criminal enterprise operating through formal structures of governance. Visual exhibits mapped connections between Mayor Riker, more than 40 shell corporations, 17 nonprofit entities, and financial transfers spanning 7 countries. Asset tracing placed the cumulative value of fraud, identity theft, and laundering activity at approximately $2.3 billion over 8 years. The monetary scale was staggering. The human toll was harder to quantify. Thousands of individuals experienced compromised identities and destroyed credit histories. Trafficking victims moved through structured corridors shielded by financial and administrative insulation. By late afternoon, Minneapolis was no longer the quiet epicenter of a concealed network. It had become the focal point of one of the most expansive federal corruption and trafficking prosecutions in modern U.S. history. Entire neighborhoods had absorbed waves of crime patterns that statistical reports struggled to explain. Residents filed complaints, insurance claims spiked, property values shifted. Publicly, the response remained measured. Privately, federal analysts documented a widening gap between reported activity and enforcement outcomes. Immigration rulings issued years earlier sat unexecuted. Final removal orders gathered dust while document fraud networks recycled identities, allowing individuals to re-enter administrative systems under new credentials and restart the cycle. In the weeks that followed the initial raids, enforcement continued in structured phases. ICE officers executed final removal orders on individuals who had exhausted all legal remedies. Federal agents dismantled document fabrication hubs that had supplied replacement identities at industrial scale. Prosecutors expanded. Indictments to include facilitators, financial intermediaries, and compromised officials identified through seized communications and transaction records. The ripple effects reached beyond Minnesota. In Columbus, Ohio, a nonprofit executive resigned abruptly and left for Canada after federal subpoenas were issued for financial documentation. In Dearborn, Michigan, a city council member announced he would not seek re-election and retained criminal defense counsel amid inquiries into affiliated grant allocations. In Seattle, a state refugee coordinator took an unexpected leave of absence days before scheduled testimony before a legislative oversight body. The underlying model that investigators labeled Northbridge architecture had relied on structural insulation, using legitimate administrative processes as cover for illicit activity. What the Minneapolis case demonstrated was that the architecture could be mapped, traced, and dismantled when coordination aligned. Thomas Riker had not relied on overt coercion. There were no recorded threats, no public intimidation campaigns. The mechanism was procedural. Bureaucratic systems function through documentation. Funding flows through grants and compliance certifications. Oversight mechanisms often depend on accurate reporting and voluntary disclosure. Control the paperwork, redirect the funding channels, delay or dilute oversight, and parallel governance structures can emerge within legitimate frameworks. Investigators concluded that complexity itself had been deployed as a shield. Layers of shell corporations, interlocking nonprofit boards, encrypted financial transfers spanning multiple jurisdictions, international routing that blurred audit trails. The assumption appeared to be that the administrative burden of unraveling the structure would outweigh the perceived benefit of intervention. For nearly 8 years, that calculation held. Federal agencies identified anomalies but lacked consolidated visibility. Local officers observed irregularities but lacked cross-jurisdictional reach. Journalistic investigations raised questions without access to classified financial intelligence. Policymakers debated reform while funds continued to circulate through compromised channels. It ultimately required a classified interagency task force operating in strict compartmentalization for 16 months, combining signals intelligence, forensic accounting, human source reporting, and digital surveillance to assemble a prosecutable blueprint. Even then, execution demanded synchronized coordination across agencies that traditionally operate within distinct mandates. ICE led immigration enforcement. The FBI directed criminal investigations. Treasury pursued financial seizure authorities. NSA provided technical intelligence support. The U.S. Attorney's Office consolidated evidence under federal prosecutorial standards. The aggregate impact was historic. More than 83,000 individuals were flagged for immigration. Enforcement review. Over 300 criminal indictments were filed. Asset seizures exceeded $40 million in real property, vehicles, currency, and financial accounts. More than 20 officials faced arrest or formal charges tied to conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction-related offenses. An entire municipal leadership structure came under federal prosecution scrutiny. The case entered federal training curricula as a study in how organized criminal enterprises can adapt to exploit legal frameworks, and how layered corruption can persist when oversight mechanisms fragment across agencies. Yet the most consequential variable in this entire sequence was contingency. If the encrypted hard drive recovered from the trafficking residence had been destroyed, if financial records had been successfully purged from offshore servers, if interagency coordination had faltered under institutional hesitation, if risk calculations had favored delay rather than action, Project Northbridge might have remained embedded, expanding quietly across additional jurisdictions. Instead, the system was forced into the open, and once illuminated, its complexity ceased to be protection. If that hard drive had never been seized, the structure would have continued uninterrupted. The shell nonprofits would still be cycling grant money through layered accounts. The document fraud hubs would still be manufacturing identities on demand. Trafficking safe houses would remain sealed behind reinforced doors, and Thomas Riker would still be inside City Hall, advancing the next expansion phase under the protection of administrative complexity. Power does not always arrive with sirens and force. Sometimes it adjusts procedures, it amends forms, it reshapes funding streams, it rewrites compliance language, and waits for institutional memory to fade. It positions itself behind policy language while constructing mechanisms of control. It depends on distraction, on fatigue, on the assumption that complexity equals legitimacy and that paperwork equals transparency. The deeper warning extends beyond one city and beyond one network. When governance becomes transactional, when oversight mechanisms exist but are not rigorously enforced, and when accountability depends on political convenience rather than structural integrity, systems become vulnerable to quiet capture. The Northbridge model demonstrated how layered entities, overlapping boards, and fragmented jurisdictions can be engineered to blur responsibility. This case is not defined solely by arrests or indictments. It is defined by exposure, by the moment a concealed structure was mapped in full. The most dangerous assumption in any system is not that corruption exists. It is the belief that it could never embed itself deeply enough to operate unnoticed. State Tone will continue breaking down complex federal investigations, organized crime structures, and systemic corruption cases with documented detail and verified facts. If you believe stories like this deserve full exposure, engage with the report, share your analysis in the comments, and follow the channel for continued investigative coverage. Because the greatest risk to any system is not open defiance. It is silent infiltration that goes unquestioned.